You're listening to World Talk Radio, where the world comes to talk.
This is Jerry Prokopovich with Civil War Talk Radio. There are many fine regimental histories available on the bookshelves, often written by people with a connection to their regiments, perhaps through their ancestors. What happens, though, when the regiment you want to write about turns out not to be the 20th Maine or the 24th Michigan, one of the great heroic regiments of the war? Is there still a story? There definitely is in the case of the 33rd New Jersey. We'll talk today with John G. Zinn, author of The Mutinous Regiment, the 33rd New Jersey in the Civil War, when we return on Civil War Talk Radio.
Everyone faces conflict. At home, at work, in the community, in the world. Fix Your Conflicts is a show about how to fix those conflicts with practical tips and techniques. Doug Knoll brings to the internet airwaves the first of its kind, a show that teaches peaceful resolution to life's daily battles. That's Fix Your Conflicts with Doug Knoll, broadcasting live every Monday at 11 a.m. Pacific on World Talk Radio, Studio A.
Marissa, are you ready yet? I know you can hear me. You are not missing school again. Marissa! You trying to be a nobody or something? Let's go! All right then. Hit it. I know you can hear this. Hey guys, move closer. That's it. Girl, I am not leaving.
Hey, whatever it takes, don't let your friends drop out. A real friend can make all the difference.
Cut that noise, yo! I'm coming! Took you long enough. Thanks for the help, guys.
For more ways to help, go to OperationGraduation.com. A public service message from the U.S. Army and the Ad Council.
World Talk Radio, bringing the world to you.
Welcome to Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopovich, coming to you today from the campus of East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina, on a brilliant spring day in March 2008. But, as always, speaking on my own behalf and the guest doing the same, not representing the university, not engaging with the public more than, well, yes, actually we are, and I bring that up because this past week here at ECU, we have been treated to a series of lectures and seminars on the scholarship of engagement. It's the latest buzzword in the higher education world. Don't be detached, don't live in your ivory tower, but be engaged with the community and with the public. For those of us who teach Civil War history, that's all we've done our entire careers. We have a public audience. We respond to their concerns. We write books for their edification. We listen to their criticisms. But apparently there are many branches, not just of history, but of academia in general, where people do their work without the slightest concern for what the public thinks. And indeed, if you're working on molecular physics, it wouldn't make much sense to stop in at Walmart and ask people what their views are on your research, because you're really not going to get much useful feedback. But somewhere along the line, there's a line in between where people are perhaps writing history that no one reads but other historians, writing literary criticism that no one reads but other English professors, working out economic theories that are too arcane to be used in public policy. And that's where you get this backlash of education gurus trying to sell a program of scholarship of engagement to us who are up here in our ivory towers, not engaged, not speaking to you, the listening public of Civil War Talk Radio. So I'm of two minds about it. Here we are indeed engaged, as we are every week in this discussion and dialogue, and I always enjoy emails from listeners and suggestions for other guests, and enjoy talking to people on the show. whether they are academic members of academia or not. And I've long maintained on this show and elsewhere that historians have an obligation to the public to present their works in understandable form and to address issues that the public is concerned about. On the other hand, as our economics chair wrote persuasively to the rest of the professoriate here, work in some disciplines, when it's carried on at the cutting edge of those disciplines, is not comprehensible by the ordinary person in the street. Indeed, it's not comprehensible to those of us who are in other departments. I can't read the papers at the highest levels of other departments down the hall, philosophy or sociology or economics, and claim to be able to judge them or even understand them. So how is that work supposed to directly engage the public if indeed it's carried on at the frontiers of knowledge, not at the ground level of knowledge? So there are things to be said on this debate, and they will be said at great length here at ECU and other campuses. But I thought I would share that with you today, a thought about where higher education is going and how some fields don't have the equivalent of Civil War talk radio. They aren't talking with anyone but themselves. But we are here talking with people, and self-promotion being a big part of the show, I will point out I'll continue to talk with folks about Did Lincoln Own Slaves and other frequently asked questions about Abraham Lincoln, published by Pantheon Books, which is available online bookstores and your local independent bookstore and anywhere else. And I'll next be talking about that on Saturday, April 5th at Fort Branch, North Carolina, which is an historic site on the Roanoke River, which brings up a public service announcement if you should happen to hear this in time for April 5th, 2008. And if you listen to the archives and hear it after that, get ready for April of 2009. But on Saturday, April 5th, 2008, there will be the annual nationwide Park Day, an effort, a volunteer effort to clean and restore Civil War-related battlefields, cemeteries, and shrines, underwritten by a grant from the History Channel and recognized by the U.S. Department of the Interior. According to the press release, it says 110 historic sites in 24 states will be participating in Park Day, and I will be participating in the one at Fort Branch, North Carolina. If you're in the eastern part of North Carolina, find it on the web, come out and see this remarkable site, one of the few, if not the only, Confederate fortifications that still has some of the original ordnance in place, overlooking the Roanoke River, now in private ownership but being restored, and we'll be out there cleaning up the site and then having lunch, and then I will talk a little bit about Civil War topics with those who are there. So hope to see you on April 5th at Fort Branch or wherever you are. If there's a Civil War site in your reasonable driving distance, find a way to get out there on April 5th and contribute to the cleanup effort. Well, enough about that. Let's move on with today's subject, which is a regimental history, a book titled The Mutinous Regiment, the 33rd New Jersey in the Civil War, and the author is John G. Zinn. Mr. Zinn, are you there?
I am, Jerry.
Great. May I call you John?
Please.
I'm glad you could be on the show. You're on the show because you did what good authors do when they want to get their books out there. You cold call on people and send them a notice about your book or a review copy. I'm not shy about self-promotion, and I appreciate that you took the time to send an email about this book of yours, which I found very interesting.
Thank you.
It is published, let me say a word before we get started talking about the substance of it. It's published by McFarland Publishers, and I'm curious how you got in touch with your publisher. How did this book come about?
It was originally going to be published by a small publishing house in New Jersey, and that didn't seem to be moving forward, and so I had permission to look elsewhere. And McFarland, I started looking for publishers who had published other things about the Civil War, especially regimental type things, and found McFarland and submitted the things that they asked for, and they immediately wrote back and said that they would like to publish it.
Well, I'm glad that worked out. There's a sort of hierarchy maybe a taxonomy of publishers that publish Civil War books, and you know, I had a Professor Ernest May back at Harvard University. And I haven't told our guests, our listeners, in a long time that I went to Harvard. That used to be a staple on this show, that I'd get that in every show. So there's a reminder, yes, I went to Harvard. And when I was there, one of my advisors was Ernest May, who once told us in class, they say you can't judge a book by its cover. You don't even need that. You can judge a book by its spine.
Okay.
And when you're in a hurry, that does make sense. His point was that you can tell by who published something a little bit about it. And McFarland certainly has a record of publishing interesting things about the Civil War, sometimes in more detail than a larger house might choose to publish.
Right.
But very reputable.
Mm-hmm.
You can go in other directions. There are the academic presses that deal in Civil War books like LSU or UNC. And then there are other directions where we'll not name names. I'm not sure which organization you were thinking of in New Jersey, but there are certainly some small publishers who publish really obscure Civil War stuff, and then there are the ones who verge into the weird political fringe stuff about
right.
the Civil
This was
War.
not one of those. That's true.
It's not one of, and I want to assure our readers, McFarland is our listeners. McFarland is certainly not one of those, and his book is not one of those. And just to wrap this up, you really can't judge a book by its cover in these cases. Not too long ago, we had on the show someone who had published a book, really a self-published book, by the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. And self-published books are often at the very bottom. If no one's going to publish your book, there's a reason usually. But this book turned out to be wonderful. And
right.
Your book, likewise, very well produced, nice cover, nice photographs, thoroughly researched, and tells an interesting story. So,
Thanks very much.
To listeners who say, "Why isn't this UNC Press?" Don't be put off by McFarland. Go get this book. So, back to how it originated. What was your what brought you to be interested in this particular regiment?
Well, what happened was I'd always had an ambition to research and write a book, and I've always been interested in the Civil War, and also interested and concerned about how the history of New Jersey has never been adequately studied and taught. And so I was looking for a topic related to New Jersey and the Civil War, and when I started looking at that, I had no idea that New Jersey had 40 regiments that had served in the Civil War, or even that 4 of them had served in the West, and looked at there were some that had already been written about, and was reading a history of Newark by John Cunningham, and he had a couple of brief references to the 33rd, where he said that they were a storied regiment who had left a trail of glory and savagery throughout the South. And that certainly sounded like it merited more inquiry. And so that was really what got me started.
So you began looking for materials about this regiment at that point?
Right. And of course, I started looking to see if there had been a 19th century history written by, typically those are written by members of the regiment, but there was nothing like that. Then there is a book that was written shortly after the Civil War by John Foster called New Jersey and the Rebellion, which is a sort of a history of every New Jersey regiment, but they're very fragmented histories that don't even come close to telling the whole story. And I moved on from there to the official records, and then trying to track down whatever correspondence journals and that kind of thing did exist from members of the 33rd.
So you started out then collecting some data, but this was something you were interested. You said as a personal interest. This was not your day job.
I'm actually retired from what used to be my day job, but that's correct. It was a personal interest, not related to my. I was working in the financial field.
I see. So you were. So just something you wanted to. Did you have a personal connection, a relative in this regiment?
No, not at all. A lot of times that's what happens is that people write about a regiment that their ancestors served in, but no, none of my ancestors. Some of them were here before the Civil War, but they were too young to have served in it or something like that. Those kind of situations.
Well, I think there's. I'm certainly in the same position. My grandparents immigrated in the early 20th century to the United States, so I had no personal dog in this fight, but it doesn't stop it from being my history and one that I find very absorbing. I'm always, I would say, even a little put off sometimes when people assume that you must have a relative or that's the main reason why people get interested in the war is their own connection.
There has to be some personal connection.
But the connection can be, the connection is just as real without being personal, certainly.
Absolutely.
So you began collecting the material. Well, let's start with the title of this, the Mutinous Regiment. It's not the Heroic Regiment. It's tell us about how they got started, how they formed, and how this mutiny comes about.
Well, basically, the regiment was formed in the summer of 1863, which I'm sure you and many of your listeners are aware was probably one of the worst possible times to form a regiment. The people who the demand for soldiers was escalating dramatically. The North was, trying to continue to build its forces. At the same time, the people who were going to serve because they had a commitment to the cause were already in the service. So, there weren't as many people available to serve. And finally, there was no illusion left as to what war was going to be like. I mean, this regiment is formed shortly after Gettysburg, and those casualty lists are very real, and were very real in what they were reported in the New Jersey newspapers. So, not an attractive time. The federal government responded to that with a combination of a carrot and a stick. The carrot were bounties or cash bonuses paid for enlisting, and they were a significant amount of money at a time when the average factory worker made about $300 a year. The stick was the Conscription Act of 1863, the first draft in American history. And in addition to including, it was a draft based upon population quotas, it also included a commutation fee where you could buy your way out of the draft, or where you could hire a substitute to take your place. Now, today, the idea of a fee or a substitute is very controversial, but in those days, what was controversial was the draft, not those other things. Those other things were considered to be fairly normal.
Now, people said the commutation fee, paying $300, which is, as you say, a year's salary for a blue-collar worker, is turning us into the rich man's war, poor man's fight scenario. Is that accurate? That's
certainly what the attitude would be today. But while it was talked about in those days, it was not as controversial as this whole concept of the draft. The draft was just in New Jersey, and I think also in New York, looked on as just this violation of personal freedom or something like that. So that was really the controversial issue. What happened was that the governor of New Jersey, who at that time was a Democrat, went to the Republican administration in Washington and asked for permission to try to fill the regiment. It was not just the 33rd, there were a couple of other regiments, to fill them with volunteers. And if they could do that, well, then they would be exempt from the draft. And how do you then get people to do what they don't want to do on their own? Well, you offer them money. And so what happened was that there was the federal bonus, there were the federal bounties, there was a small state bounty. But then what happens is that Newark and communities in New Jersey start paying their own bounties or bonuses. And there's a big difference between the way they're structured. The federal government, I guess probably having learned the hard way, paid those bonuses over the entire term of the enlistment. So you got a certain amount down and so much a month, obviously giving you the incentive to serve out your term. In the municipal bounties were paid on the spot or as soon as you enlisted. And that opened the incentive for bounty jumping, enlisting, collecting your $300, and getting out of there as fast as you can. And in a time when there are no fingerprints, no means of identification, it's not that hard a thing to do. What happens is that ultimately 25% of the original 900 members who enlist in the 33rd desert before the regiment even leaves the city of Newark, much less come under the fire of Confederate guns.
So they're not off to a dashing start. You've got 900 men.
And then what makes it, and I think what makes it worse then for the men who stay is that, we have this image of the Civil War regiment marching off to war with flags flying and bands playing. Well, that was the 33rd's experience, but there was another element added to that. They were guarded front, rear, and side by the 3rd Vermont, making sure that nobody else deserted on the way to the dock.
So not an auspicious start. Let's take a short break here. We'll come back in just a moment. We're talking today with John Zinn, author of The Mutinous Regiment, the 33rd New Jersey in the Civil War. I'm Jerry Prokopovich, and we'll be right back on Civil War Talk Radio.